If you mention the name Larry Bird today, your mind probably goes straight to the Boston Garden. You think of the three-time MVP, the legendary trash talker, and the man who, along with Magic Johnson, literally saved the NBA from the brink of collapse in the 1980s. But in the fall of 1975, the legend of Larry Bird was almost over before it even started. While other future stars were honing their skills in elite programs, 19-year-old Larry Bird was back in French Lick, wearing a city work uniform instead of a jersey. Having walked away from a major scholarship, he took a job as a local garbage man. For an entire year, one of the greatest geniuses in basketball history was content hauling trash and painting park benches for a few $100s a month. Convinced his future was pouring concrete, not making the Hall of Fame. How does that much potential just walk away? And what was it about his blue-collar roots and a series of raw personal tragedies that fueled the most competitive fire the game has ever seen? Today, we're looking past the championships and the 50, 40, 90 seasons. We're going back to the roots. This is the story of how a small-town garbage man, driven by poverty and a brutal work ethic, became a global icon. This is the real story of Larry Bird. To understand the man who would eventually be called Larry Legend, you have to look past the championships and the MVP trophies. You have to go back to a time when his world was very small, very quiet, and very poor. Larry Bird was the fourth of 6 children born to Joe and Georgia Bird. In the 1950s and 60s, French Lick wasn't a tourist destination. It was a hard-scrabble town where people worked with their hands until their knuckles bled. The Birds lived in a house that was constantly under siege by the elements. In the winter, the furnace was a suggestion rather than a guarantee. Larry grew up knowing exactly what it felt like to be cold in your own living room. His mother, Georgia, was the backbone. She worked double shifts at a local diner, her feet swollen after 12 hours of pouring coffee and serving eggs to neighbors who were just as broke as she was. But the most complicated figure in Larry's life was his father, Joe. Joe Bird was a veteran of the Korean War. He was a man who brought the silence of the battlefield back to the hills of Indiana. He was a construction worker, a man of immense physical strength who battled the twin demons of alcoholism and depression. In a house with 6 kids and a fluctuating income, stress wasn't a guest. It was a permanent resident. For those of you in our audience who grew up in that era or who have worked blue-collar jobs your whole lives, you know the code. You don't talk about your feelings, you just go to work. Larry tells a story that serves as the blueprint for his entire NBA career. He once saw his father come home from a job site with an ankle that looked like it had been hit by a sledgehammer. It was a deep, sickening shade of purple and red. Joe couldn't even bend his leg to get his boot off. Larry and his brother had to literally pull the boot from his foot while Joe sat in agonizing silence. Most men would have called out. Most men would have taken a week off. But the next morning at 5 a.m., Larry heard the sound of those boots hitting the floor. Joe Bird had forced his swollen, broken foot back into the leather. He went to the site. He worked the full shift. Larry watched that. He absorbed it. To him, basketball was never work. It was a privilege. But he applied his father's construction site mentality to the hardwood. If Joe could work on a broken foot to feed his family, Larry could play with a broken finger, a split lip, or a back that felt like it was being poked by hot needles. This is why Larry often says that poverty was his biggest motivator. He wasn't playing for fame. He was playing because he was terrified of going back to that cold house. He was playing because he knew that in a town like French Lick, if you aren't the best, you're just another guy at the construction site. He became obsessed. He would hit 200 shots before school every single morning. If it rained, he shot in the rain. If it snowed, he cleared the court. By the time he was a sophomore in high school, he wasn't just good. He was a machine, but he was a quiet machine. He didn't want the spotlight. He just wanted the security that came with being undeniable. But as his talent grew, so did the pressure. The hick from French Lick was becoming a local hero, but inside, he was still that kid who felt the chill of the Indiana winter. He was about to find out that the world outside French Lick was much bigger and much colder than he ever imagined. By 1974, Larry Bird had become a legend in the tiny gymnasiums of southern Indiana. He had grown to 6'7". He was averaging 31 points and 21 rebounds, and every major college coach in the country was knocking on his door. The choice seemed obvious. Indiana University. It was the biggest stage in the state, led by a coach, Bobby Knight, who demanded the same perfection that Larry demanded of himself. On paper, it was a dream. In reality, it was a nightmare. When Larry arrived in Bloomington, he didn't feel like a star. He felt like a target for a kid who had spent his entire life in a town of 2,000 people. A campus with 33,000 students felt like a hostile city. But it wasn't just the size of the school that bothered him. It was the social divide. Larry arrived at the dormitory with his belongings in a cardboard box. He looked around and saw kids with fancy luggage, expensive cars, and clothes that cost more than his mother made in a month. For the first time in his life, Larry Bird felt less than. The Hick from French Lick label wasn't a badge of honor back then. It was a weight. He felt like an alien in a place that was supposed to be his home. After just 24 days, not even a full month, Larry Bird did something that baffled the sports world. He packed his bags, walked to the edge of campus, and stuck his thumb out. He hitchhiked all the way back to French Lick. To the outside world, he was a quitter. To the people in Bloomington, he was a kid who couldn't handle the big lights. But Larry didn't care about the narrative. He just wanted to breathe again. Back home, Larry didn't hide in his room. He did the opposite. He went to work for the city of French Lick. He became a garbage man. Now, I want you to think about this for a second. This is a guy who could have been the king of college basketball, living in a dorm and being treated like royalty. Instead, he was waking up before dawn, hanging off the back of a truck and picking up the town's refuse. He was painting park benches in the humid Indiana summer and clearing brush from the sides of the road. For a lot of people watching this, you know that there is a specific kind of peace that comes with manual labor. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end to the day. You see the street clean behind you, and you know you've done something real. Larry loved it. He would later say, "I felt like I was really accomplishing something." How many times are you riding around your town and you say to yourself, why don't they fix that? Here I had the chance to make my community look better. But he wasn't just settling. He was finding his footing. During this time, he got married. He was playing in local AAU leagues just for fun, and he was perfectly happy being the best player nobody knew about. He played in parks against older men, honing a street toughness that you don't learn in a sanitized college practice. But while Larry was finding peace on the back of that truck, the world wasn't done with him. Scouts were still whispering his name. Coaches were still driving down those winding roads, hoping to catch a glimpse of the 6'9" kid tossing trash bags. He thought he had escaped the pressure of the spotlight. He thought he was going to be a city worker for 30 years and retire with a pension and a quiet life. But a series of events was about to unfold, some miraculous and some deeply tragic, that would force Larry Bird to realize that he couldn't stay a ghost forever. The garbage truck was a sanctuary, but the parquet floor of the Boston Garden was his destiny. By 1975, Larry Bird had settled into a rhythm that most people thought would be his forever. He was a local hero in French Lick, but he was a hero who worked for the city. He was married, he was working manual labor, and the dreams of greatness in Bloomington were fading like an old photograph. But while Larry was content, the basketball world was restless. They knew a talent like his didn't just disappear. One man in particular refused to let the ghost stay in the machine. His name was Bill Hodges. He was an assistant coach at Indiana State University, and he had heard the stories. He had heard about the 6'9" kid who could pass like a point guard but was currently hauling trash bags. Hodges didn't just call, he showed up. He drove to French Lick and found Larry at his mother Georgia's house. Larry was polite, but he was firm. He didn't want to go back to school. He had tried that. He didn't want the crowds, the noise, or the feeling of being an outsider. He told Hodges about a friend of his, a guy who could really play, hoping to deflect the attention. But Hodges was a veteran of the psychological game. He looked at Larry and delivered a line that would haunt him. He said, "Larry, they're gonna say that about you someday. They're gonna say there was this kid from French Lick who could have been the greatest, but he was too scared to leave his porch." Hodges didn't wait for an answer. He stood up and walked out. He left that sentence hanging in the humid Indiana air, knowing that for a man as competitive as Larry Bird, being called scared or average was worse than being dead. But while Larry was wrestling with his future on the court, his world was about to be shattered at home. His father, Joe Bird, was a man who had spent his life fighting in Korea, fighting on construction sites, and fighting the silent, crushing weight of depression and alcoholism. By 1975, Joe was divorced from Georgia, buried in debt, and struggling to find a reason to keep moving. For those of you who have experienced the ripple effects of mental health struggles in a family, you know there is a specific kind of darkness that descends when the breadwinner loses hope. Joe Bird believed a lie that many men in his position tell themselves, that his family would be better off without him. He believed that the life insurance money would be a better provider than he could ever be. On a cold February day, Joe Bird called his ex-wife. He told her she wouldn't have to worry about the creditors or the alimony anymore. He said his goodbyes, hung up the phone, and took his own life. Larry was 18 years old. The death of his father didn't just leave a hole in Larry's life, it left a scar on his soul. Larry was best friends with his father. They shared a silent language, the language of work, of toughness, and of rural pride. To see his hero give up was a betrayal that Larry could never fully articulate. He didn't go to therapy. He didn't take a year off to find himself. Larry did what the Birds always did. He hardened. He took all that grief, all that confusion, and all that repressed anger, and he buried it deep inside. He used it as fuel. He realized that if his father had sacrificed everything to try and provide for the family, even in such a tragic, misguided way, then Larry had a responsibility to make something of himself. He couldn't stay on the back of a garbage truck while his mother struggled to pay for his father's funeral. 2 days after Bill Hodges' mic drop on the porch, Larry called him. He was ready. He wasn't going to Indiana State to get an education or to have fun. He was going there to destroy every opponent that stood in his way. He was going there because he realized that basketball was his only way to ensure that the Bird name stood for something more than debt and tragedy. When Larry Bird stepped onto the campus in Terre Haute, he wasn't the same kid who had hitchhiked out of Bloomington a year earlier. He was older, he was colder, and he was carrying the weight of a father who had worked until he broke. The hick from French lick was gone. The legend was about to be born. When Larry Bird arrived at Indiana State University in Terre Haute, he wasn't just a basketball player. He was a myth that had finally become flesh and bone. He was 20 years old, older than most sophomores, and he carried a quiet, focused intensity that unnerved his teammates. The scouts who had dismissed him as a quitter or a small-town wonder were about to be silenced. Indiana State wasn't a powerhouse. It was a mid-major school that rarely saw the national spotlight. But with Larry Bird on the floor, the Sycamores became the most dangerous team in the country. He wasn't just scoring 30 points a game. He was rebounding like a center and passing like a point guard. By his senior year in 1979, the Sycamore Revolution was in full swing. Indiana State went on a miraculous undefeated run, 33 wins and 0 losses. They weren't just winning, they were dismantling teams. And for those of you who remember the media landscape of the late 70s, you know this was a massive story. It was the hick from French lick taking on the world. But as the 1979 NCAA tournament reached the final round, the narrative changed. It was no longer just about Indiana State, it was about a clash of cultures. In the other locker room was a charismatic, smiling point guard from Michigan State named Earvin Magic Johnson. This was the most important game in the history of basketball, period. It remains the highest rated college basketball game ever televised, with 35 million people watching. Why? Because it represented the ultimate American dichotomy. You had Magic, the Showtime energy, the Hollywood smile, the future of the flashy urban NBA, and you had Bird, the stoic blue-collar worker who looked like he'd rather be hauling hay than doing a post-game interview. Michigan State won that game, 75-64. Larry Bird played poorly by his standards, shooting only 7 for 21. As the buzzer sounded and the confetti fell for Michigan State, Larry Bird sat on the bench with a towel over his head. He was devastated. In his mind, he hadn't just lost a game, he had failed his town, his mother, and the memory of his father. But what Larry didn't realize at that moment was that this loss was the best thing that ever happened to the NBA. The rivalry was born. The Cold War of basketball had its two generals. Magic had the trophy, but Bird had a new fire in his belly. He was headed to the Boston Celtics, a team that was currently in the gutter of the league. Red Auerbach, the legendary Celtics GM, had drafted Larry a year earlier in a move that many called a gamble. But as Larry Bird packed his bags for Boston, he wasn't thinking about the money or the fame. He was thinking about Magic Johnson, he was thinking about the garbage truck, and he was thinking about making sure he never felt the sting of second place ever again. When Larry Bird arrived in Boston in 1979, the Celtics weren't just a bad team, they were an irrelevant one. They had finished the previous season with a dismal 29 wins. The city's fan base was cynical, and the NBA itself was struggling with its identity. But Red Auerbach, the cigar-chomping mastermind of the Celtics, knew something the rest of the league didn't. He knew that talent wins games, but a garbage man work ethic wins championships. The impact was immediate. In his rookie year, Larry didn't just improve the team, he transformed the entire culture. The Celtics jumped from 29 wins to 61. It remains one of the greatest single-season turnarounds in sports history. But for Larry, being Rookie of the Year wasn't enough. He wasn't there to be a star, he was there to dominate. Between 1984 and 1986, Larry Bird did something only 2 other men in history had ever done. He won 3 straight MVP awards. This was the peak of Larry Legend. He wasn't the fastest player on the court. He couldn't jump the highest. In fact, compared to the athletic freaks of the modern NBA, he looked almost out of place. But Bird was playing a different game. He was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. He possessed a spatial awareness that was almost supernatural. He knew where the rebound was going before the ball even hit the rim. He knew where his teammate would be before they even made their cut. He was a basketball savant with a construction worker's grit. For those of you who grew up watching this era, you know that Larry Bird's greatest weapon wasn't his jump shot, it was his mind. He was perhaps the most vicious trash talker the game has ever seen. But it wasn't just talk, it was psychological warfare designed to break a man's spirit. He wouldn't just tell you that you couldn't guard him, he would tell you exactly how he was going to score on you. He'd say, "I'm going to take 2 dribbles, step back to the left and fade away, and there's not a damn thing you can do about it." And then he'd go out and do it. There's the legendary story of the 1986 three-point contest. Larry walks into the locker room, looks at all the other contestants, the best shooters in the world, and simply asks, "Which one of you guys is coming in second?" He then went out, didn't even take off his warm-up jacket, and won the whole thing. This arrogance wasn't born from vanity, it was born from his childhood in French Lick. When you grow up with nothing, you develop a desperate need to be undeniable. You don't just want to win, you want to make sure your opponent knows they never had a chance. By the mid-80s, the Bird Magic rivalry had reached a fever pitch. Every game was a war. Every championship was a statement. Larry had become the face of a city that saw itself in him. Tough, hardworking, and unapologetically blunt. But while the world saw a man at the height of his powers, the years of pushing his body to the absolute limit were starting to take their toll. The blue-collar pride that built the legend was about to become the very thing that threatened to end it. In the summer of 1985, Larry Bird was at the absolute summit of the sporting world. He was the back-to-back NBA MVP, a global icon, and a millionaire many times over. But despite the fame and the fortune, Larry's heart had never truly left the dirt roads of French Lick. And it was that refusal to change who he was, that stubborn blue-collar pride, that would ultimately change the course of his career forever. Larry wanted to do something nice for his mother, Georgia. He decided she needed a new gravel driveway at her home. Now, any other superstar in his position would have made a single phone call, paid a contractor, and forgotten about it. But that wasn't Larry's style. In his mind, if a job needed to be done, you did it yourself. Paying someone else to do something he was physically capable of doing felt wrong. It felt soft. So Larry Bird, the greatest basketball player on earth, spent his off-season shoveling tons of gravel and hauling heavy stones under the hot Indiana sun. He spent days bending, lifting, and twisting, and during that work, he felt it. A pop in his back, a misalignment of his spine that would haunt him for every single day that followed. He didn't know it then, but he had just traded the longevity of his career for a gravel driveway. For the rest of his life, Larry Bird would live in a world of chronic, excruciating pain. For those of you who have worked manual labor or dealt with the physical toll of a long career, watching Larry from 1988 onwards is heartbreaking. He wasn't playing against opponents anymore. He was playing against his own nervous system. He had to spend 4 hours before every game in the trainer's room just to be able to stand upright. He had to wear a back brace that looked like a piece of medieval armor. There's a legendary image of Larry lying face down on the parquet floor next to the bench while the game is going on. He couldn't sit in a chair because the compression on his spine was too much to bear. But the moment he checked into the game, he was still Larry Legend. Even with a broken back and bone spurs in his feet that required him to cut holes in his sneakers, he was still averaging 20, 10, and 7. He was still outsmarting the younger, faster athletes who didn't understand how a man who could barely walk was still beating them. This leads us to the fascinating duality of of Larry Bird, the assassin versus the country boy. To the NBA, he was a cold-blooded trash talker who would step on your throat to win a game. But to himself, he was still just Joe Bird's son. He famously refused to buy a Mercedes or a flashy wardrobe. He once said, "I can't see putting $50,000 into a car when our house growing up was worth $10,000. I just can't buy that." He would wear clothes he got for free and preferred eating at a local diner over any five-star restaurant in Boston. He was a millionaire who lived like he was still one paycheck away from poverty. Why? Because that fear of losing it all never left him. That garbage man mindset was his armor, but it was also his burden. He was a man caught between two worlds, the bright lights of the Boston Garden and the quiet gravel driveway in French Lick, and in the end, it was his refusal to leave the latter that cost him the former. On August 18th, 1992, Larry Bird sat in a crowded press conference and told the world what his body had been telling him for years. It was over. He was 35 years old, but his back was 70. He retired not because he lost his touch, and certainly not because he lost his nerve, but because the garbage man had finally given everything he had to the streets. But when we look back at Larry Bird today, we aren't just looking at a basketball player, we are looking at a symbol. In an era of sports that feels increasingly defined by branding, marketability, and image, Larry Bird remains the ultimate antithesis. He was a man who didn't care if you liked him, he only cared if you respected his work. He was the bridge between the old school grit of the post-war generation and the global explosion of the modern NBA. For those of you who grew up watching him, you didn't just see a player hitting shots. You saw a reflection of the values you were taught, that you show up early, you stay late, you don't complain about the pain, and you let your results do the talking. Larry Bird was proof that you could be the best in the world and still be a hick from French Lick. He proved that you could conquer the big city without ever letting the big city change you. The rivalry with Magic Johnson saved the NBA, but Larry Bird's character saved something deeper. He reminded us that greatness isn't about the highlights, it's about the gravel driveways. It's about the boots you put on every morning when your body tells you to stay in bed. Larry once said, "A winner is someone who recognizes his God-given talents, works his tail off to develop them into skills, and uses those skills to accomplish his goals." He never mentioned fame. He never mentioned money. He only mentioned work. Maybe that's why we still talk about him today, because in a world that's changing faster than we can keep up with, the story of the garbage man who became a king reminds us of a simple truth. If you work harder than everyone else, the world will eventually have to clear a path for you. If you remember watching those Celtics-Lakers battles, tell me your favorite Larry Bird moment in the comments. Was it the steal against Detroit, the 60 points against the Hawks, or just the way he walked onto the court like he owned the building? Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the icons of older generations. We'll see you in the next one.